Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Troubadour Talks. Today, we're going to be talking about the novel Shane by Jack Schaefer. And to discuss this with us, I have Nikos Sotirakopoulos. Did I get it?
You got it.
Almost.
99.8% right.
Okay, I tried. So, Nikos, you are a commentator at the Ayn Rand Center UK, and you have a daily show there, correct? And other shows. You do a variety of shows for ARC UK.
Yeah, that's my evening job. My day job is at the university at York St. John, and my evening job is with objectivism, with ARC UK, and with ARI Europe.
Yeah, and so you also teach objectivism, or are you a TA or an actual professor? What is that?
No, I'm mostly running the European programs of ARI, and we have some events with other European groups.
Okay, great. So you're all over the place. You have a lot of different things, but all intellectual minded. But you're also doing this current event, these current event shows.
Yeah, the Daily Objective, every day with ARC UK, with people, with guests that people have also seen in your show, like Raka, like Mark Pellegrino, and Jonathan Honig.
Yeah, okay, great. So today, though, I don't think I've seen you guys talk too much about literature. So I'm excited to be able to talk to you guys about literature. I talked with Raka, except for Ayn Rand's novels, of course. And we might bring that up a little bit, but I talked to Raka about Peter Pan, and I'm talking to you about Shane. Now, before we get into an interpretation of the novel, I like to do a quick plot summary, and without all the spoilers at the very end, but I think for me, I'm somewhat pro-spoiler depending on the novel, actually. Because I think it's the only way you could talk about a book. So if you haven't read it, you could still listen to this. And I think you'll still, if you go and listen to this podcast and show, go out and read it and you'll love it still.
But let's say something to our viewers. There's still time to press pause and come back in 2 hours, literally. In 2 hours, you can read this book. And the thing, we're going to get to it, but it gets immediately on point. From the first page of the first words of the book, you're already in the plot.
Yep. Yeah. And which is great. And it's something we could talk about, but it's in my version, it's only 159 pages and they're short pages.
The Kindle version. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So it's very short. But it's compact. And I will say before we get into the plot, the version that I have, one of the quotes from an author, Ronald Smith, who I don't know who that is, but he said, if you read only one Western in your life, this is the one. Now, I've read about a dozen Westerns and I've seen a lot of movies. I love them, but I agree. This, alongside with probably Lonesome Dove, I'd say if you don't want to read like a whole bunch of different Westerns, you just want to get a sense of it, this is a perfect, and this one in particular, because like Nico said, it's so compact and like to the point that it really gives you an understanding of the genre. Okay, so let's talk about this book a little bit. So we have a character, a mysterious stranger, comes out of the mist basically and is seen by a boy, and on this Wyoming plain in 1889. And we hear that he says, "Call me Shane," and that's all we get about him and his past. We don't know his name. We don't even know if that's his real name. So we get this stranger. He comes there. He becomes friends with the family. We could talk about this later because this is such an important scene. They start working together by getting the stump out, this old tree out of there. And then Shane, this mysterious guy, becomes a part of the family, essentially. They hire him on as a farmhand. We learn that there is a rancher or a cattle ranger named Fletcher who's trying to take over this whole homestead act. Or these homesteads and the Starrett family, which is where Shane comes to their house, is kind of at odds with them, with this. And Shane, we learn very quickly, like you said, almost from the very beginning, has some kind of dark, mysterious past. We get the sense from the boy's perspective that he's probably a very dangerous man, but he's the safest man for certain people. Want to talk about that for sure.
That's the most beautiful theme of the book, basically. How Shane is the most dangerous man to enter the house, but as the guy says to his wife, he's also the safest man you've ever had in this house.
Exactly. And then the story progresses where there's basically a confrontation between one of the assistants or the hands of Fletcher, who again is the cattle ranger. And one thing about the cattle rangers is that they needed a lot of space. And so these homesteaders were kind of getting in their way. So there's a confrontation between Shane and the cattles. There's a big fight. Joe comes in and fights with them. Then later on, Fletcher hires a gunslinger named Wilson to come into town. There's a threat of serious violence. Shane and Joe fight over who's going to go and do the gunfight. Shane wins the fight by hitting Joe in the head, and then he goes and fights off
And
Wilson.
when we say fight, we mean they fight. Not everyone says, no, you go, no, you go.
Because they both want to go.
Wants them to be the one to go there and face,
yeah.
and be the man and face this very dangerous other man. So at some point, someone appears who is supposed to be something like an equal of Shane in violence capability, and then it's the end, which we don't want to spoil. But even if we want to spoil, the end is a bit ambivalent. Having said that, maybe we can do it off air. But if you want on air, I would like your take on what happens at the end. What you think happened at the end, because again, it's something which is the book leaves open.
Well, so this goes, I think, into the nature of this novel and what I think is interesting about the novel. And so I don't take it quite as ambiguous as a lot of people take. And I think this is like, so again, spoiler, Shane gets hit at the end with a bullet. And we don't know exactly, is that what you're referring to?
Yes. So basically the question is Shane walking out of there alive? I mean, he's alive, but is he dying?
Does he die? Yeah. So I think there's, so now we can get into, so one thing is we can get into the interpretation of this, but one thing that I wanted to mention with that plot is just how simple it is. There's not again, it's short, but it's not a big plot. A guy comes, they, upturn a trunk, they fight somebody. There's a little bit of conversation. It's very quick to the point, but it's so tight and it's so like powerful, and every line is packed with virility and meaning. To answer your question, my take is that this is a novel very aware of its roots, metaphorically and realistic. It's very aware of the Western genre. And it comes at a very interesting point. So Shane is this very perfect gunslinger, but he's coming into a civilization that needs him, but can't have him be there forever. And so symbolically, he comes out of the misty, mountains in a sense. And it's almost a magical, heroic person. There's almost a mystical element to him. And then he kind of leaves back into it, and he kind of needs to. And I think that's really what is going on at the end. Whether he dies or not isn't the most important question.
It's not, yeah.
Because the reality is that he is branded by this thing. He's a good man, but he's branded by this thing, and he calls it a brand of killing. And he is a killer. Even if he's a good killer, in terms of he's a good man, he still is a killer. And that brand makes it so he can't live in this civilized area, according to Jack Schaefer in this book.
And in a way, Shane is more like, I don't want to use the word tool because it's cheapening, but in a way he provides a service, but the service is not just that he helps the family with the thugs. He helps everyone become better. So when people are around him, they have to act at their best. The mother is the best cook. The husband is the best man that he can be. And of course, so beautiful how the kid, is impressed and inspired by Shane.
Yeah.
So for me, this book, first and foremost, is a primer, is basically a beautiful description of masculinity, but not in terms of masculinity, both in terms of vis-a-vis other men, but mostly how it inspires those around it, and mostly kids. So I came to this book from Andrew Bernstein, and he explained it as the best example of hero worshipping. Now, for me, that's not the number one thing, but that's very big there. So how people who are around Shane, by the mere fact that he's around and he's who he is without having to act in any way, they have to become better. So Shane, in a way, is something like a piece of art that you see, and it commands you can be better.
Yeah. No, I agree. And this is what I mean by, I think, the awareness of from the novel, the writer's perspective in particular, because it's written from, or the story is told from the perspective of Bob Starrett, the little boy. And Bob Starrett, or Starrett, whatever, he is seeing this man and come into their lives. And one of the really important parts that I think is somewhat subtle, but it's not that subtle, but I think some people do miss it when I've talked to them about this, is how Bob was actually admiring of the Fletcher Cowboys before Shane.
Yes,
so he admired the Fletcher Cowboys, their raucous ways, they're wild. Now, sometimes, by the way, they're not evil. It's only when Fletcher comes in with his contract and he uses these cowboys to harass them. And so they do have a kind of bad, but there is one particular cowboy, for instance, who's not evil. And so they're not innately evil. They're just,
Chris.
What's that?
Chris,
yeah.
Cowboy who,
Thank you. Yeah. So they're not necessarily innately evil, but they're kind of wild. They're tough and strong and things like that. But Shane, what's really interesting about him is, in contrast, one of the things is he doesn't wear guns. And yet everybody knows, even without guns, they can sense his intense dangerousness, right? His intense ability to, his competence and physical. Yeah, aura is a good way of putting it. And people can sense that about him. He doesn't need the guns, right? For daily life. And that doesn't make him a man, right? Whereas with Wilson, he has two guns, which Shane, the gunslinger that comes in, Shane even says that that's a show-off trick. You don't need two guns, right?
So for people to follow, Wilson is the guy that the rancher hires at the end. And notice that when he appears, he doesn't even wear a cape. So basically, wherever he goes, you can see his guns. Whereas with Shane, although when you actually see him with guns, the boy says, that's exactly who he is. But you could sense this without the guns, that he's a man capable of violence. But he's also a man who his biggest struggle is to control this violence. And there's something very Jordan Petersonian on this one. So one of the most famous lines by Peterson is, a harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very dangerous man who has that under voluntary control. And of course, this is exactly what we see with Shane. The minute he enters the house, they can sense this aura. So they try to figure out what it is, and the woman says he's mysterious, and the guy says, no, what you're trying to say is that he's dangerous.
Yeah.
But also keep in mind that he's the safest person you've ever had in this house, because he's someone who has it under control until he has to face evil, and actually until he cannot avoid it anymore. So there's a very beautiful scene on that where Shane is avoiding a fight, and he's happy with himself that he avoided the fight.
Mm-hmm.
It's the first time that Chris, the guy from the other gang, provoked him. So it's like, oh, you're drinking sugary drinks, ha 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 ha.
Yeah, he has soda.
Shane is avoiding this, but at some point this becomes an insult to the whole family, and then Shane has to take care of business, and he's beating. Then he beats Chris.
He fights him and he beats Chris, and then there's a big fight. And then Shane is almost beaten, and Joe goes in. And what you're saying, that I think, the Jordan Peterson idea that I like, is the old saying, it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. And that I think is very much what Shane represents, is that he is a warrior in a garden. Now there's a flip side that I think Schaefer and Westerns kind of criticize, or at least say is a consequence of being this type of person. Because it's not, so Joe is a kind of warrior. And I think it's really very interesting to compare Joe and Shane. So Joe is the same person as Shane in many ways, but he's not a killer, right?
He's a farmer.
He's a farmer.
End of the day.
Yeah, he's a farmer at the end of the day. He was a cow puncher, so he was a cowboy, but he got married, he had a kid. And this is what the interesting thing is that Shane, I think a lot of people will read the book and watch the movie in particular and be infected by the idea that Shane might be a lover to Marion, the wife. That there's a sexual tension. And I think there's a little bit, but I think really what's going on is it's more a representation of what Shane can have. You know, it's the kind of life he can give up his old ways, like Joe did, of you know, rowdiness and fighting and just being with the boys out on the range. Now he's going to be in the world of women and children and farms and stability, right? And that's what Joe is. Joe has that. Shane doesn't, you know, he's escaping or he's leaving some past. He learns that he might want that, but there's something he has to do, and it may make it impossible for him to have that, or at least in this story.
The triangle issue is an interesting one, and it's going to need its own discussion. But there is one part, actually, if you allow me, in the Fountainhead, which really reminds me of Shane. So it's when we first meet Rourke. It's on page 6, and this is how his house, the mother of Keating, describes him. So he says, he always made her uncomfortable in the house, and Keating's mother.
In her own house, right?
In her own house.
Yeah.
He made her uncomfortable in the house with a vague feeling of apprehension, as if she were waiting to see him swing out suddenly and smash her coffee tables, her Chinese vases, her framed photographs. He had never shown any inclination to do so. She kept expecting it without knowing why. So I think also in Rourke, there's this attitude that he's the calmest man, but there's a volcano inside him. That there's this, that you can sense that this guy is one of a kind. You can sense that there's something in this guy. And Rourke is indeed a dangerous guy in terms of dangerous to evil. So as we find later with one particular dynamiting, but that's for a different.
Well, but I think it's what, you know, with Rand, she's not putting it in like an action hero fighting necessarily, although she does have some characters in Atlas Shrugged that have that. But it is the inner power and strength of a man that she focuses on. And that, I think, is what Peter Keating's mother is picking up on, just like Shane, is that he doesn't need his guns. He could walk around just in normal clothes. And you could tell, I think one of the lines here is he was like a coiled spring or something like that. Like he looked like a coiled spring, ready to just pounce, like he was always alert. And you could just tell he was ready to explode into action at any moment. And he's Shane in particular, just like Howard Rourke, doesn't talk much. He's very quiet. He almost comes across shy to some degree, although I don't think he's shy, but he comes across that way. But so for instance, you don't know that he loves the Starts. You don't know that. He doesn't say I love you, but his actions say it, right? He protects them. He teaches Bob, and he risks his life for them. And that's how he says it to them. He's a man of action, not a man of many words. And so I think there's just something about, with Ayn Rand's character, the same kind of inner power and inner strength that Shane represents, that is this kind of man of action person. That's
and actually the only time he, quote, gives a speech, it's a speech to those who are the other homesteaders. And the idea is that, look, you have to, basically you're worthless. You have John who is putting his life on the line for you, and you don't stand up to evil. Yeah. So that's the only time. And the other time we hear him talk is either to the child, and always very in a sweet way, in a very, very affectionate way. Yeah. Or to the bad guys. So to the bad guys, we see him being, he has these one-liners, like, oh, no, they tell him, we're going to rough you up a bit and then we're going to kick you out. It's like, okay, that's your plan, but you forget some, he has this kind of one-liners to the bad guys. And also to Mariam. To Mariam, he doesn't talk a lot, and it's as if there's one point where they look at each other in the room, and the boy says it's as if it's only the two of them in the room. Yeah. Which again reminds me of Rand. There's a scene where Hank Reardon stares to Dagny when they give the press conference, and it's when he tells her, I'll ride the first train with you. And Rand says it's as if it's only the two of them in the room, although the room is full of people.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have to talk because, again, his aura talks for him, and his inner knowledge of who he is, that he's capable, talks for him. And that's why also before confrontation, he's very relaxed.
Yeah.
A theme you will see every time.
He appears relaxed, but he's very alert. Like they stress the alertness. And he even says to Bob, "Oh, you're a man who's alert. You'll make something of yourself. You're a man who watches." And there's a big focus on watching and being aware. And Shane is always watching people when they come to the star. He's very like assessing of them.
Exactly. And that's why, in a way, Shane reminds me of a very good self-defense teacher who is at the same time always alert, but always capable of knowing the violence. So one of the first things you learn in self-defense is go and sit in the back of the room with your chair's back at the door so that you see every room. And if there's like a mass shooting or something, you can run or whatever.
Yeah.
And notice that Shane does the same.
He does the same thing.
He sits where he can see the whole house so that if there's anyone coming towards the house, he can protect the family.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's also the way the author, Jack Schaefer, does this is very interesting, where it is a kind of slight to the family at first. So the way he does it is his first night having dinner with them, he stands by the chair where Joe, the father, normally sits. And Marion, the wife, is a little bit put off by this. Joe shakes his head and they all sit down. And Bob talks about exactly what you're talking about, how he always has his back to a wall. He never sits by a window. He's always assessing everything and watching everything. And this is a really good, artistic way of demonstrating that he has been accepted by the family as a protector. And Joe is aware of his abilities as a fighter and as a protector, and he allows that to happen. And I think this is a big plus to Joe Starrett, who is a masculine man, just like Shane. And in
appearance, even more muscular. He's bigger. He's more broadly shoulders and stuff.
Exactly. He's much more physically dominating, which I think is interesting. And he, it does seem that there's a equality in their physical, like, if Bob asks him, "Do you think you could beat Shane in a fight, a fist fight?" And he says, "I think I could do it if I had to, but I would never want to, and they do fight. And the only way Shane wins is by hitting him in the head. And so with the gun.
Which is a surprise hit. So the tension starts rise. So to give context to the people who haven't read, so the tension starts rise on who is the one who's going to fight the hired gun that the bad guy has hired.
Yeah.
And just as the tension starts rising, so Joe says, "I will go." Shane says, "No, I will go." With a surprise move, Shane hits him on the temple with the base of his gun.
Yeah.
Which basically sends him to sleep so that while he goes to take care of business.
Yeah.
And also, he makes it known that this is what happened because he doesn't want the village, the other homesteaders, to consider that Joe was a coward.
Yeah.
Because reputation among men in such a rough environment is very important. And Shane takes this into accordance twice. One is when he goes to fight Chris, when he realizes that by not fighting him in the first time, so first time Chris provokes him in the bar, Shane says, "Okay, have a good day," and leaves. But then he realizes that Chris talks. And now Shane doesn't care if he's considered coward. But then he realizes that now this reflects to the family.
Yeah.
This now reflects to Joe.
And it makes them want to fight more. It makes the Fletchers want to push their bounds more, right?
Exactly. So that's when he fights. It's not in a way, and I'll use this in the conventional term. Shane has no ego. Ego in terms of, this pump chest, "Oh, I'm going to beat you." Not in the objectivist term, careful. He hasn't got ego in the terms of the way people use it in fights and stuff.
He doesn't need to assert his dominance.
Exactly. He doesn't need to assert his dominance. And also, when there's a fight, there's something they call the monkey dance. Again, in in self-defense, which is when people start pumping their step and you realize there's going to be a fight. And they say, this is the time that you have to realize.
What's up?
Go.
What you doing?
Yeah. Shane is never like that. Shane, in every time he enters the bar, he's portrayed as, he acts as if he's alone. And even when he's provoked, initially he's sweet, but then when he realizes that there's a fight, so when he sees 5 people coming in the bar, he realizes there's a fight here. Mm-hmm. Then he strikes first because he understands that, and he tells the kids, this is going to get ugly. And although already there's this energy, let's say, with Mariam, he doesn't want to say, Mariam, oh, I beat them, all that stuff. Of course, Mariam, which is the mother, tells the kid, tell me what happened. And she's excited that, her men beat the bad guys. But Shane tells her, these are not scenes, or this is not something that a lady should have seen or something like that. So
she's excited and horrified.
Sorry?
She's excited and horrified together.
Yeah, but
right?
she's a bit excited.
No, I'm saying they go together for her attraction, maybe.
Yeah.
Right? There's the kind of horror of the danger, of the mystery, and there's an excitement that goes along with that. Just as a kind of cliche of what women might be attracted to.
Yeah.
In Dangerous Men.
It makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's, so I guess like, the way I think of Joe, I said earlier, is, and Shane, is that they are counterparts in many ways. And the stump scene for me is a really powerful demonstration of this, because the way it's described is, Shane goes out. So basically there's this huge old tree, and it's very symbolic. I'll just say, whenever you see a tree in a work of literature, it's got to be symbolic, right? At some level, even in Atlas Shrugged, the tree in Atlas Shrugged, Milton. I mean, whatever you read, if you see a tree, there's probably some symbolism going on there. And so there's this big old, dead trunk of a tree that's left there. Its roots are really deep. So if you want to think of like Fletcher, who was there before, his roots are really deep, and they got to cut that out. And so Shane starts after he's, after he's hired, or after he's given a meal from them, because he has to pay his debts. So he starts hacking away at this trunk. Go ahead.
Pause. That's not when he starts doing it.
Okay, remind
When
me.
he starts doing it is when Joe defends him against the annoying, sleazy salesman.
Yeah, that's right.
So remember, the salesman comes, and he's this annoying guy who's like, oh, Mr.
$110. Yeah.
Yeah. And Shane stands up to him, says, no, you are, this is much cheaper.
Yeah.
Anyway, and salesman says, who is this guy? No one trusts this guy. Why do you even have this guy in your property? And Joe Starrett says, no, this guy is my friend. Yeah. And that's what makes Shane go pick the egg. So he's like, okay, now I owe you something. Of course, he doesn't say it, because he would never say it. He just lifts up the axe and starts chopping.
Yeah, and he says, I found the passage. A man has to pay his debts, and then a little bit below. So Bob, the boy, says, "You don't owe us anything." Lots of times we have folks in for meals, and then his father cuts him off and says, "No, Bob, he doesn't mean his meals." Right. And so you're right. It's absolutely, it's about the fact that it's their connection together and the trust that they now share. And with that stump scene, and I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. And I think the stump scene is often described like because it goes on all day, like tirelessly. And there's a moment when Marion, for instance, says, "Use a shovel, dummy." Basically, she says, "Use a tool." And he's like, "No, we're going to use hitch it to your horses and now pull it instead of using." And he says, "No, we're going to use manpower, not horsepower." Right. And again, this, I think, is that inner will, that strength and power that we're seeing as a dominant theme in this novel. And the way it's described when they're attacking it is it eventually becomes as though Joe and Shane are almost one body, because the sound, for instance, sounds the same to Bob, and he hears it. And, for a moment, for instance, there's a pause when he thinks only one axe is striking, and then he goes back and finds that Joe is digging underneath it to be able to push it, because they're trying to get underneath one of the roots.
So they also have to rely to each other, because that's a dangerous business. If you let it, it's going to crush you.
Yeah, it's a huge stop. Yeah.
So in a way, for me, it's one of the most beautiful scenes in any book I've read in terms of male bonding. which is a bonding that happens through activity. So, for example, I've noticed that the way I bonded with my brother-in-law was when he and my sister had to move houses, and we basically were packing stuff. So I could never imagine that I would go with a coffee with him and chat. So we always bond by doing activities, and I think that's something that is very well.
You don't go on mandates with guys?
Sorry?
You don't go on mandates?
We don't do mandates. And you see this also with Rwandian heroes in a way. So what is the absolute moment of bonding of Hank and Francisco? It's not when they have the talks.
It's when they're throwing the clay in the...
Exactly. It's their common struggle against, not nature, but it's when they have to throw the clay, when there's this leakage of, I don't know what it was.
It's like melted steel. Molten steel is like, and they have to throw clay to kind of cover the spots that have been leaking, I guess. And it's like, and it's described in very similar way to Shane and the Stump and Joe, in terms of like they're one kind of person and they're kind of each in rhythm and they're flowing in a perfect symbiosis. And then they come back and, Hank is very enthralled by this and energized by this moment, just like they are, just like Joe and Shane. But yeah, Ayn Rand understood that bond, I think, better than a lot of modern men do, that it's through, work and through action that men tend to bond. Really.
And also Rourke, if you think, both with, what's the name of the worker, Mike. But also with Cameron, first they work together, they prove themselves to each other, and then they start hanging out.
Yeah.
So it's always bonding through work. And notice that in that scene, Shane and the father don't exchange almost a single word. And when it's done, they stare at each other. They don't do like, hey, high fives. There's a stare, an understanding of what they've achieved, and then they go in to have the dinner, the cookies, or the whatever the mother
the apple
burned,
pie.
the apple pie.
Yeah. Well, and there's a great line that breaks them all up in laughter when Shane says, because Marion is fascinated by them when they finally are pushing the stump over. So she forgets about her apple pie that she made a big deal about. And she wanted to feed them. Right. And so it burns. And then she's like, oh, you silly men. And then she goes in and she puts down their food and she doesn't talk to them. And she, gets the apples, cuts, does all the stuff, puts it in, and she sits in front of the stove until it's done. And then she brings it out and she's like, here. And it's described, it's almost like a mini version of the stump activity. It's her version of that. And Shane even says, this is the best stump I've ever had. And it's a kind of recognition of the idea that this bond that you're talking about happens through the product of their work and what they're able to accomplish together. And then,
to be honest, I never understood that scene until you explained it now. So I sense that there's something meaningful in what Shane said, but it's only now that I get that it was a reference that like this was also your struggle, and here we appreciate each other's struggles in a way.
Well, you said it earlier too, like Shane makes everybody be better, right? And she doesn't want to give him a burnt pie or give up and say, oh, that's too bad, right? She said she had a good pie and she wanted to prove it, and she did. And then, they even joke about, it's so good, we could spread rumors about it and we could open up our own little, inn that people will come to, and Joe will take their money and she'll cook the pies for them and everything. But it's her struggle. It's her, and I think some modern people might take the offense to this, but it's, feminine activities in this case is being beautiful, which she takes pride in, and cooking. That's how she can provide for these men who do things that she's not capable of doing, because I don't think she would be capable of moving that stump a bit. But these two men can. And I think
now that you mentioned the modern interpretation, I have to say, I had a look at a couple of academic articles on Shane, and
I wouldn't even want to do that. That's horrible. I couldn't imagine.
It was like one of these videos, which is like, I don't know, a thing that you don't want to see, but you're like, okay, maybe I have to see it. They suck the life out of. It's like you don't get anything. Anyway, sorry. Back to Mariam though. So I'm surprised you said that you don't think there's something there. I definitely think.
No, I didn't say there wasn't something there. I said I think there is, but I don't think that's the main point.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That's all I'm saying. I don't think the sexual tension is the main point. Even Joe Starrett recognizes that Shane is a better man. And then remember, after he says this to Marion, she says, "Oh, Joe, kiss me and hold me all night," right? She chooses him. But the point, and that's because she recognizes who Shane is, that Shane can't stick around in the long run. Although Joe will. Also she loves Joe's, that again, he has the same inner strength that Shane does. That's what they recognize in each other. And I really think that the main difference between Shane and Joe is Shane's ability with a gun. That's it. Shane is the same person as Joe. And I like that he's smaller even. And maybe that's even why he had to get so good with the gun, is that he couldn't do what Joe might be able to in a fist fight. Although he proves himself in a fist fight for sure. But he is a gunslinger through and through.
Although he knows there are fights ahead, twice he knows there are fights ahead, he doesn't get his gun.
Yeah.
He's good in moves that hand-to-hand combat.
Yes.
He only gets the gun when he has to face the hired killer, and now he understands that. And also, here's something else that just occurred to me. Maybe the reason he uses the gun then is he knows that his job there is done. Whatever happens, he's gonna leave. Therefore, he's not. Now he can take his gun again because he's not anymore part of this idyllic, how it's called. It's a Greek word, I can pronounce however I want. Area in the land.
Oh yeah. Yeah, well, he there's a speech at the end, a very short speech. He's not a man of many words. Like you were saying earlier about Shane talking to Bob. And this is after the gunfight, and this is toward the very end. And he says, "A man is what he is, Bob, and there's no breaking the mold. I tried that and I've lost." So what I take that to be is, there's a big to do about his clothing when he comes in there. At first, at the very beginning of the novel, he takes pride in his appearance. And this is partly because he is a man used to having money. And they even mention this. He's a man who's used to having money because he's a gunslinger. He always gets paid for his job. He gets high pay. And he has nice clothes. He has nice black leather boots. He has a really nice gun. I mean, he is a man who's used to making money from his gun. Being a hired hand is probably what he did, like a bodyguard and some level. And that's what he got paid for. When he changes his clothes to dungarees, this is a step down to some people. And Fletcher points this out, right? He says, "You're better than this. I'll hire you. I'll pay you to do things. I'll pay you way more. I'll pay you triple," or whatever he says, "than what you could get as a farmer here. You shouldn't be a farmer. You're better than that." And it is kind of like, he's also described by Bob as, you could tell he didn't know quite what he was doing right away, but he was a fast learner, right? So he's not a farmer. And the whole point, I think, is that, I tried, like the quote says here, "I tried that and I lost. I've lost." And that's because he's not a farmer. A man is what he is. He is a gunslinger. And that's what he is. And
I think there, though, he's a bit more dramatic than he should, because it's the situation that pushed him to that. It's the situation.
No, but why did that situation occur in the first place? Why did the situation occur? Why did they hire a gunslinger in this story?
Because they knew. We get, first of all, that's something which, again, I didn't get it even in the first two readings of the book. Joe, when he hires him as his. So basically, we forgot to mention this. So initially Shane wants to leave immediately. They tell him, "Okay, stay for the night." Then next day it's kind of raining, but they do the chopping of they uproot the tree, and then John says, "Stick around. You're gonna be my handyman. Let's say you're gonna help me with the farm." But we get the idea that Joe has in the back of his head that this is the guy I need to stand up to the bullies, because he had someone who they bullied earlier, and that person left. So in a way. That's why I say in a way Shane is a tool, but tool doesn't sound right. So he's in the valley because Joe foresees that at some point I need a guy like this with me.
Yeah.
That's why the wife at some point is pissed off with Joe. Says, look what you did to him, which means you made him fight again, which is what he didn't want to do.
100%. Yeah. And that is the dilemma of Shane, is that he, by his presence and just who he is, and, Fletcher realizes more and more that he's going to have to get more and more violent. And like that, there's a sense, I take it, where there's a precipitation or a pushing along that Shane brings about his counterpart Wilson. That because Shane is there, Wilson needs to be there in order to force this action. So there's like when people start hearing, when the homesteaders start hearing about Shane in the valley, like that he's there with them. He says that they say that guy's a powder keg. He's about to explode. Maybe it'll be a good thing for us. Maybe it'll be a bad thing. We don't know, but we do know that because he's here, there's going to be some kind of action. And that, because again, just by his nature and reputation, right? People like, I think Chris or one of them had heard about him, that there's just kind of like Fletcher knows he can't push it too far because there's this guy here. And the only way to push it farther is to have his own gunslinger. And that's where Wilson comes in. And so that I think is part of the dilemma of why a man is a man, and it's a brand. That once you're a gunslinger, you're always a gunslinger. And there's always going to be someone who wants to prove themselves, or, that you force that kind of action in people. That's the now, whether that's true in reality, I don't know. We could have that discussion separately, but that is, I think, Schaefer's point about gunslingers. And that's the Western viewpoint of gunslingers.
Right. So you have more of an experience with Western, so you see what I couldn't see, because what I see there is that another reason why he leaves is that by him leaving is the only way for the couple to be happy and the family to continue. Because he says, I cannot continue being there since I've killed someone.
Yeah.
But also I think by leaving, it's in a way my job here is done. And also this cannot go on forever. You can, this triangle, Platonic, the way people, again, use it, not in the philosophical, this Platonic triangle could not go on forever. So in a way, he makes space. By the way, it reminds me a bit also of the ending of the Dark Knight. Although it's not my favorite Batman film, but at the end, when he leaves, because he understands that for who he is, the best thing to do is to leave. And I think it's the same as with Shane.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think there's definitely a parallel to the Dark Knight, to a lot of Westerns. In fact, if you saw the movie Logan, Shane, the movie, it plays a huge role in that story. I don't know if you've seen the movie Logan.
No, but by the way, at the end, if you can send me your best Western films, but most importantly, book recommendations, I'd really appreciate this.
Yeah, I've done a lot of shows on Westerns. I love the movie. I'm
mostly a spaghetti Western person, so beyond spaghetti or beyond... Sorry?
I don't think those are Westerns.
I know the line, yeah. And I've watched some John Wayne, but beyond that, I haven't got any experience, so I would be very happy to take your recommendations.
Okay, yeah, I'll definitely send that to you. And what I was saying at the beginning is Shane the book, written in 1949, I think represents a very mature genre. That the genre that started probably in the early 1900s. There's a book called The Virginian in 1902, where they're taking this mythology of the American frontier with the history. And there's a kind of combination, and they're building these stories about the ideal man in the frontier. And that's what the Western is always about. It's always about the men who bring civilization into savage lands. And what you see men like Shane, again, this coming out of the misty mountains, this, he strode in the summer one morning out of nowhere. He's a savage, just like Joe was a savage when he was a cowpuncher. The cowboys are savages. Civilization comes when you plant your roots. That's what Joe says. That's his whole perspective, is this old cattle ranching way. That's not the way to do it anymore. It's too much space for too little reward. He said the better way for the future is to have a fenced in area to really, and this is, the future of efficient farming. And he's right about that. And that's the future. And that's what civilization in a sense, but it's also in Westerns, it tends to get related to religion. sometimes, but also family, particularly the wife, what's called the petticoat brigade, like the women of a city and their morals and the way that they think that you should act and things like that. But at the end of the day, it's civilization that you're bringing, and you're confronted with this wild, savage land that sometimes can be Indians, sometimes it can be outlaws, sometimes it could be a sheriff versus a posse of people. It's a variety of little things, but that's the essence. And Shane, I think, is the ultimate perfect. He's almost a superhero. He's on the level of a superhero level hero. And what makes this so, why I call this the mature genre book, is because it's aware of the effect the Western hero has on culture. That's what Bob represents. Bob is hero worshiping, just like, you're right, just like kids who watched the movies of Westerns and then eventually the TV shows and the books idolize these Western heroes. So Bob idolizes this hero, and he's almost not fully real. He's, that's part of, I think, what's going on. He doesn't have a background that we know of. He just comes out of this misty past.
Can I ask you something with a slight risk of derailing the discussion?
Oh, of course.
So you mentioned spaghetti
I'm all about
westerns.
derailing.
You mentioned spaghetti westerns are not really being westerns. But don't you think that Shane is, he reminds me a lot of Clint Eastwood from the trilogy, mostly For a Few Dollars More, because he shows up out of nowhere in a town. He's helping, or maybe also For a Few Dollars More, but in For a Few Dollars, he's helping Marisol escape, and he doesn't have any reason to do so. But it's that he's this kind of man. He doesn't talk a lot. He comes out of nowhere. He helps people. He leaves, although he does it for the money. But isn't there a sane attitude also in Clint Eastwood?
So Clint Eastwood is someone I hate, actually. I think he's one of the more evil people in film history, in my perspective, because he's the one who effectively killed the Western hero. And High Plains Drifter is the classic example of this, where now that's not a spaghetti Western, that's an American movie, and he directed and starred in it. And the whole point of this movie is that it plays on the tropes that you and I have talked about the man of strength, about the man who women love, about the man who's capable of fighting. But the difference is that instead of, the conflict that we see with Shane, we get a man who just accepts it and pushes that view on people as, well, why are we even debating about this anymore? This is what you just have to do. So in the first 7 minutes, he gets in a fight, he kills 3 men, and he rapes a woman. Like, that's the first 7 minutes of, High Plains Drifter. He is the quintessential anti-hero. He's the reverse of the hero, right? He's not someone you should look up to. He's someone, like Bob looks up to Shane. He's someone that is dangerous, and that we just have to accept, in a sense, the citizens have to accept that kind of danger is a kind of evil, and we have to unleash that evil on the people we need or want to. That's not the same as Shane. Shane is a good man. He's very different from the Wilson character. He's a man of loyalty. He's a man of, he does what he says he's going to do. He trusts. When he does trust, he trusts completely. He, there's a whole bunch of other traits. He's friendly to people who are good to him. And he also is, he follows through with what he says he's going to do. And his word is his bond, right? So he's a good man. And he's also competent, right? This is the farming part. When you get Clint Eastwood, he's just a murderer. That's it. He's basically just a murderer. Now, the spaghetti Westerns, the problem I have with them is it's basically a bunch of Europeans who don't understand America and the Western and the frontier. And they don't understand like this conflict between civilization and the savage lands and what kind of man it takes. So you have these stories that are basically, they see the archetype of, the Wade Hatton, which is like Dodge City, a classic 1939 Western movie. They see these movies, they see Shane, who's this mysterious guy with no past. And so they make movies like The Man with No Name. And they don't understand at all why he does what he does. They just think of him as like a pure gun. And he's just a tool, like you said. And I think that's where that perspective comes from, is it's just like, he's just a tool. and we just have to put him in the right direction and he'll just do what's right or not. Right. And that's so they lose all of the moral meaning behind Westerns that you see from 39 to 73 a lot, in movies in particular.
So how old do you reckon Bob was in the
11.
book?
He's 11.
Okay, so when I saw the spaghetti westerns, and particularly because we had a video club, I guess what you would call blockbusters in the States, in the corner. It was a small one, so the only one I could find was for a few dollars more. Mm-hmm. So I had watched for a few dollars more 10 times. So whatever Shane was for Bob, the man with no name in For a Few Dollars More was for me. He was my first proper masculine symbol.
Yeah.
So I absorbed everything from that film because I was not allowed to watch very violent films at that age. So Rambo, for example, was a forbidden fruit. I had to go to my uncle who had more loose morals to watch Rambo. So the spaghetti western was my contact with this world. That's why in my mind it's and of course, compared to the anti-heroes of today, the man with no name is a paragon of morality if you think about it, compared to, I don't know, a Tyler Durden, for example. But that's for another discussion.
Well, or a Rambo who's a crazed vet, basically.
Yeah, but Rambo is good. I mean, Rambo is in a way too good. He's too naive in his benevolence and his dedication and his loyalty to the mission.
Yeah, I just think starting in the 70s, I mean, to some degree in the 60s, you start to lose a lot of this moral meaning behind the characters. And it becomes more about money, and it becomes more just specifically about, paying them off, and that's it. And as long as they get their pay or whatever. And it's not about, like with Dodge City, which is, I think, a movie that everybody should, if you're interested in this, start with Dodge City, My Darling Clementine, Stagecoach, all in 1939. So these are movies that come out in 1939. It's a conscious effort by filmmakers in America to define on a mass scale America's past, right? And a lot of our tropes start with those movies. And I think it's Wade Hatton in Dodge City. So Dodge City is this famous city in America that was lawless, and it was wild, and people were shooting each other in the streets. And there's a little bit of truth behind this, as I understand it. But but this is like way on the frontier. So one of the things about these stories, just like in Shane, is the nearest lawman was 100 miles away. And
yeah, the sheriff is away. So, and the idea is until sheriff comes here. But by the way, you mentioned this, but also notice how Fletcher, or what's the name of the bad guy?
Fletcher.
Everything is within the realm of some normality. So when does the hired gun kill the guy? First, he has to provoke him.
Yeah.
There are witnesses. Says, look, he asked for a fight. Now we're going to have this fight. So we are not in the realm of anarchy, but we're in the realm of basically the law is there, but it's far away.
Yeah, he's not like a straight up murderer, because there are, I think what's going on is, like I said, they're on the frontier, and the nature of the frontier is that it is the Homestead Act. It's wild lands, and you don't have the structures of government yet. And so, one of the famous stories in the Western is the sheriff, the single sheriff. There's one guy, watch High Noon, Rio Bravo. There's one guy, and, there's a posse of villains who want to do something, and he says no, right? And the question in those two movies is, can the sheriff recruit people to help him in this battle? But the question is, he has legitimacy because in this case, he's the sheriff. So Shane does not have legitimacy, really. And you see this also with movies like The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, where there's a conflict between the laws, which are books, and then the enforcement of those laws, right? And the same thing with Shane. Like, Fletcher should not be doing these things, but there's no one to enforce that. The Homestead Act is a law by the government that said you could have a certain amount of property if you worked that land, which he was doing. Fletcher's perspective, which is somewhat legitimate to people, I think, and I understand it, is he was there first. And in the movie, I don't remember this, I don't think this is in the book exactly, but in the movie, they did a good job where he talks about No, this is in the novel as well. He's like, man, I fought these Indians off. Like, this land is capable of being cultivated by you homesteaders because me and men like me who came here before you, because he's an older man, we fought the Indians off. This land is not, you're not being scalped because of me, basically.
That's probably in the.
I think that's more the movie.
In the movie,
yeah.
There is one mention to scalping, but it's a joking when Bob has a knife.
Yeah.
His father says something like, "Okay, don't scalp too many India" or something like that, jokingly.
No, I didn't mean scalping. I just meant like what he says, and I think he makes reference to this in the novel. It's just that I came first. I made this land tenable for you people to come here, right? And in, part of the homesteaders, so it's not just Joe Starrett, but it's also some foreigners, and it's also, former rebels, right? And it's former Confederates that are there. And part of the story of the frontier is, often you'll see these stories in novels and movies happen starting in 1865. And there's a reason why they do that. And that's because part of the question is, how can you form a land now in this new world, in this new frontier, when you have Rebs with Yanks, right? How do they get together? How do you live together with these different types, with cattle ranchers who want all the land and farmers who need fenced in land, right? And there's a conflict, and sometimes that conflict requires a gun.
Remind me something. Isn't John Wayne in Searchers a former Confederate?
He's a former
soldier?
Confederate, yeah.
I don't know now if I remember this, or at some point I thought whether Shane could also be a Confederate
He's
soldier.
From Arkansas.
Although it doesn't, sorry?
He's from Arkansas, so I think he could have been, if I remember my history correctly.
Though the dates don't match. I mean, how old do you think Shane is, by the way?
That's a good point. 1889, so he probably is, you're probably right. He's probably too young to have been in the war. Like, he was probably a boy or something like that in the war.
I pictured him being around 40.
Oh, okay. I was thinking like 30s, but maybe you're right. But yeah, I don't, 30s, 40s. Yeah, him and Joe, probably 30s, 40s of some sort. Yeah, so that's a good point. I don't think he was in the war himself. He probably is too young. But the backdrop is still, with these homesteaders, and I think one of them was in the war, if I remember correctly. One of the older ones of the homesteaders, wasn't he in the war? Wasn't he a Confederate?
I remember one was half Indian, and that's why.
That's right.
He gets. I think it's so. The way the hired gun tries to attract people to fight is he hits where it hurts. So I think with the half Indian guy, he calls him something, and with Joy, he says, "Oh, I'm not gonna only take your house, I'm gonna take your wife," or something like that effect. Yeah. Not exactly with these words, but to that effect.
Yeah. Yeah, in the movie, they made a big deal about the Confederate is the one who gets shot by Wilson. He's a Confederate. And they make a big deal about that. And I think it's the same thing as the Indian, but in terms of the point is the melting pot question of America, right? How do you make that work? And then how do you make it work when there's a force that doesn't want to abide by the law? And that's what Fletcher does. Fletcher is, he doesn't like the Homestead Act, and he's the power in that area. There's no law. So there's a question of, well, what do you do? And in this case, Shane comes in and takes care of business, right? And that's kind of his role. The problem is that he's a killer now, again, and he might attract more killers. This is one of the critiques that people have had, including Clint Eastwood. I mean, this is what Clint Eastwood's whole, I think, point is that a killer is a killer. Why question it? That's all he is. And that's all he can be. And whereas the Westerns from, early on until about Clint Eastwood's era, there's a kind of question of, can they do both? And that's the dilemma. And with Eastwood, it's no longer a dilemma, just murder.
To make the moral case for the man with no name, though, remember that scene where he takes the sheriff and goes to someone and says, "Your town needs a new sheriff." So I think he's a mixed character, but overall he's a force of good. But we can do another discussion on the spaghetti.
It's been a long time since I've seen even any spaghetti westerns. My fundamental point is there is a stark difference between the 39 to late 50s era hero versus what starts to happen in the 60s and then culminates in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in 69, and High Plains Drifter in 73. And that there's, if you watch a lot of movies from that era, 39 to 73, you'll see the shift into the anti-hero where they're mostly, the Wild Bunch happens, I think, it does happen in the 60s, I think mid 60s, which basically it's just a bunch of people going nuts and killing everybody, all the Mexicans, basically.
I don't watch the last, I've watched one Clint Eastwood, I think The Unforgiven, and that's the only Western I've watched post spaghetti Western. I declined to watch the new Westerns, and I don't think even Django, which is, okay, Tarantino is his own thing, but I didn't enjoy it at all.
I didn't watch that. Yeah, I'm talking about like 39 to like 60, 1960. Right. And then it starts to shift in the 60s, and the spaghetti Westerns come in I think the late 60s, 70s in particular. That's when they start. Yeah. The 70s in particular, I think, is when they start hitting. So I mean, the point is with Shane, he is a good man who is put in a difficult situation. His conflict is the conflict of the frontier, which is how do you use violence, right? That's the conflict. That's his internal conflict. And that represents the external conflict. That's how I see it, is how do you guide or hone violence?
And to, like, as parting word, would you agree that Shane is the best Ayn Rand book not written by Ayn Rand? So let's say someone gave you 10 good books without the title of the author and told you, pick 10 books which could have been written from Ayn Rand. The number one I would pick would be Shane. Of all the books I've read.
The only thing about Shane that would make me hesitate on that is the conscious awareness of the moral situation that you see in Rand novels. It's often criticized of her that she has these long speeches, but another way of taking that is that these heroes, whether it's Kira and We the Living, Howard Rourke and Dominique in Fountainhead, Dagny, Hank, Francisco, John Galt, these guys are more consciously aware on a deeper level of the situation and what it means. And they have reasons. They have deep reasons that they express. And Shane doesn't. Like he has little things, like he says little things, but he is more purely the man of action. Howard Rourke is a man of action, but he's also a man of thought, very thoughtful. He questions the problem of the dean right at the beginning, and he's constantly asking and thinking about what's going on and how do I operate in this world. Shane, again, maybe in a thicker novel by Jack Schaefer, maybe that would have played out more, but it's not there. So I just think like he's more like an action hero, just a pure action hero who has a little bit of an understanding. And so you talked about your childhood. So when I was growing up in the 90s, the main things that I thought of that I was experiencing were a lot of action movies with like Jean-Claude Van Damme. The guy with the ponytail, what's his name?
Steven Seagal.
Thank you. Steven Seagal. A whole bunch of, this is also the Arnold Schwarzenegger action movie here era, Sylvester Stallone. So yeah, a lot of those. And the Jean-Claude Van Damme typical story of all these action movies in America was a man walks into a town, he's from some place. There's like a bar scene for some reason. And some guy pinches a girl's butt and then he scissor kicks him in the head, right? He doesn't think about it. He's like, you don't do that to the ladies, right? And he does the right thing without questioning. One thing that's different about European novels in particular, like my first time reading Les Miserables, Jean Valjean, is I had hair at the time and I almost tore my hair out because there's a scene when Jean Valjean, who is now the mayor of the city, he's the factory owner, he's reformed quite a bit, but he's not using his real name. And there's a man who's caught, and he's an ex-convict, and there's a man who's caught who they think is Jean Valjean, and he's going to go back to prison, even though it's not really him. Obviously, he's this reformed mayor. And there's this scene in this attic where he is just going back and forth, contemplating what's the moral thing to do. And it's like this reasoned essay on morality, basically. And I was like, just do the right thing. You know what the right thing is. And that is what I think action movies like Shane, like American novels have, and American stories, is it's like they just know the right thing and they just do it. But the problem with that is that they don't have reasons behind it, right? They don't have an argument for why the gun is needed and why they should use the gun, for instance. That's Clint Eastwood's critique. It's like, it's just a gun for murdering. Okay, we're just going to do that. That's high. But
listen to this line, which is something that also you've spotted. So again, this is from the first chapter. And the kid talks about saying, also notice that we see the whole film through the eyes of the kid, so it would be different to process what goes on in the hero's mind. But, quote, the eyes were endlessly searching from side to side and forward, checking off every item in view, missing nothing. And this reminds me of how Rand describes gold. His number one characteristic is the perceptiveness.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's why I think, of course, highly unlikely that he knew of Rand. I don't know if Rand knew of him, but this apotheosis of the heroic, for me, brings me to the Randian universe. So that's why I said playfully. So, and this is not with any objectivist hat. I'm just an aficionado of objectivism. I'm not any authority. Playfully, I would say this is my favorite Rand book, which is not written by Rand.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like I said, I think the action part of it, my whole point is there's the perception part of it, but the characters don't have a clear, articulated, conceptual awareness of the morality. That's what I would say is a big difference. So Ayn Rand's characters, they struggle conceptually through these works, through the story. And they think, here. And that's a lot of people don't like that about Rand, but I think that's one of her best characteristics. Is that they are going through, Howard Roark has to solve the problem of the Dean throughout the whole story. That's what his speech culminates in at the end. John Galt kind of already knew some of this stuff, but the other characters, Hank Rearden and Dagny, they have to identify a premise and they've made a mistake and they don't understand it. Kira has to understand, where she can in We the Living, where, why it's impossible for a person like her to survive in the Soviet Union. She cannot do it. And there's a reason for that. She thinks that there might be happiness possible with her and Leo. Yeah. So anyway, that's I agree with what you're saying about the hero. And there's a kind of sense with this hero, but he just doesn't have the fullness of an Ayn Rand character. That's my only question about it. So yeah.
No question about that. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, man. Any last? So maybe our parting thought would be why you chose this novel for our discussion, and then we could say goodbye.
So I chose this novel because there are many novels that are good in many ways, but there are few novels that are about one particular thing. And for me, this is the healthiest and best portrayal of masculinity I've seen anywhere. I'm not including Rand novels here because obviously having read them 5-8 times each, I'm prejudiced. But now that I think about it, also Sane was one of the books that I've read it, and within something like a month, I reread it again because it was so, and I read it because I was thinking, is it that good or could it be mostly in my head? And when I read it, I was like, yeah, it is that good. So it has this healthy portrayal of the virtues of masculinity, which don't have to be particularly in men. I mean, these virtues are good in everyone, but it's in a way, it's impossible not to be carried away by this energy of saying, I was Bob. Whenever I'm reading this, basically I'm Bob. I'm carried away with the aura of Sane.
Well, if I can end by one thing, so I agree with all that's amazing, and I think it is a perfect example of the value of heroes in our lives to help guide our actions and to be a model. And there's I was putting together, I haven't been able to do it, but I want to teach a course on cowboys and knights and the comparison between knights. And part of what people don't realize is like knights in the 12th century were like roving bands of wild, in real life, roving bands of very wild, men who would do tournaments and jousting, and they would kill people a lot, and there would be battles, and sometimes they would cause harm because these were the sons of landowners, but they were the second or third son, so they weren't going to inherit anything. So they had nothing to do, and they did, they had a little bit of money. The point is that there's a novel, or novel, it's like an epic story called by Christian de Troyes called Yvain, or the Night of the Lion. And a lot of these knight stories, these Arthurian tales, are about how to be a good person. And it's trying to the audience are these rough and tumble boys, and showing them the value of being a good man, fighting for fighting against the bad people rather than just fighting anybody. And it's the same thing very similar to cowboys is, a boy like Bob could grow up to be a cowboy and harass people, or he could grow up to be like Shane and be a good man who's a warrior in a garden rather than a gardener in a war. And that, but to use his force when appropriate versus again, these other. So I think that there is when you say masculine and it's also applicable to women, I mean, it's true, but I think that these types of novels are very particularly applicable to boys. And I think it's a weird modern trend that we don't separate a view of boys versus women.
I was a bit politically correct. You caught me on that.
I got you. Yeah, because there is something, the kind of violent energy that is in a lot of men has to be honed. If you ignore that, it's going to cause problems because it's a reality. And I think these types of stories give boys like Bob Starrett and like you and like me, a model of this is how we have to act. I mean, we have to not beat up people or get all aggressive and angry at people for the sake of it. We need to be warriors in a garden. So
couldn't agree more.
Yeah, that's all I got. Well, Nikos, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you pick some more novels and or movies, and let's have you back on and let's chat. It was wonderful.
Thanks a lot.